Where are women in times of war? Women at War and its Aftermath is a new podcast where we explore the stories of women who fight and mobilize for what they believe in. What does it mean to be an agent in war or in peace? How might women's activism and involvement in politics take many forms? The first series focuses on stories of women in the Maoist People's War in Nepal. My name is Hanna Ketola and I'm a researcher based in London, originally from Finland.
Hi, I'm Swastika Kosoju and I'm also currently based in London, working as a consultant in international development. I originally come from Nepal.
The amount of support given by the foreign organizations usually goes to organizations that are not working for the conflict victims. So it goes in the hands of NGOs, and for us to move forward, we are not even asked about it. That is our problem.
Hello everyone and welcome back to our third episode. If you have listened to the previous episodes and are keeping up with our podcast, you would have already heard about Rashmila's and Sita's stories of how they got engaged in the victims movement and their reflections on the different kinds of struggle they have faced. In this episode, we will delve deeper into the relationship between the women activists and the human rights NGOs that they are in close contact with. You will meet Devika, who you heard just now, and hear more from Rashmila as we listen to their stories of negotiating and establishing relation with NGO actors. What emerges is a picture of tense interactions where the actions of NGOs and women activists intertwine in complex and intriguing ways. We first wanted to say a little bit about the presence of international actors in Nepal and their involvement in various peace-building efforts. You know, it is a well-known fact that every time there is a big change in a country, be it political or in times of crisis, there is a huge international response in the form of goodwill or, help. The international actors have always been in Nepal, providing relief and support when these kinds of events take place. For example, in 2015 Nepal's earthquake, there were thousands of international NGOs and donor organizations that rallied together to provide relief to Nepal and the Nepalese people. Similarly, the period directly following the peace agreement in 2006 was characterized by increased and multifaceted international engagements in the so-called peace-building process. This meant donor governments and NGOs sending in a legion of missions, consultants, and advisors.
Yes, and this is exactly what intrigued me.
So when did you arrive in Nepal and who were you representing at that time? Also, was this your first exposure to Nepal?
Yes, I came to Nepal in 2008 to work as an intern in a Nepalese child rights NGO. And back then, it was still at the height of international presence, including the UN mission in Nepal. I remember how one afternoon I was having lunch in a small restaurant next to the NGO's office in Kathmandu with my then boss and later friend. She spent most of lunch telling me, frustrated, about a conflict sensitivity workshop she had recently attended, organized by a foreign donor. Whilst everyone else had sat and politely listened, she had stood up and spoken about how the considerable expertise in conflict sensitivity amongst people attending the session was being completely overlooked. In her opinion, this was expertise that she and others had developed by continuing to conduct their work throughout the war. Unlike many large international NGOs, they had found ways to negotiate and continue working in areas that had become Maoist strongholds. Yet, come the peace agreement, and this expertise was not recognized as valid. Instead, they were now being educated by a foreign donor about conflict sensitivity. I kept thinking about this conversation, and I became very intrigued about who gets to speak and act, and in what way, in the context of peace building.
Yes, and that is so true. And I can totally relate to this. With all the years of experience I had working in Nepal, somehow, most of the time, smaller NGOs and community-based organizations need to deal with so much bureaucracy when interacting with the larger INGOs donor agencies. And it always seems to be a top-down approach with the international actors, mostly because they have the access to funds, they have a set of targets that they need to reach, and also they have the technical expertise. But So do the local organizations. I mean, they have lived experience of losing loved ones through disappearances and unlawful killings, which makes them relatable to other victims. And, this is also a key form of expertise, but it may not be considered technical or valuable on paper, but is vital in the process of post conflict peace building, even if it is not recognized as such. They also struggle to convey their valuable insight because of language barrier. I mean, not all local NGOs, stakeholders, or even the government is an expert in the English language. And I think if they could develop proposals or concept papers in Nepali, they would by far excel the international standards. I mean, there has always been complex negotiations and contestations going on between the various international and national level NGO and experts. The local people who are actual experts with hands on experience don't even get a look in, they get left behind. So, the question is who gets to be an expert?
In this episode, we illuminate these contestations from the perspective of the women activists. We explore the kinds of micro-level interactions that happen between the women activists and the district-level representatives of human rights NGOs the women are in close contact with. These are well-established NGOs with a national-level presence and connections to foreign donors. We explore how these NGOs seek to represent the victims in relation to the international actors, how they position themselves as speaking for and mobilizing the women who are active in the victims movement.
Also, what we look at is who gets to speak and who is silenced. How it happens that in trying to represent the voices of women activists, the NGOs actually end up silencing them. The interactions between the individual working in NGOs and the women activists need to be understood within a wider structure of international peace building, within which the agency of the women organizing from the margins of power often goes unrecognized.
In the last episode, I mentioned how we organized interviews with the women activists in Pardia through both a human rights NGO and a victims group active in the district. This seemed to me a good research strategy. I knew that the relations between NGOs and victims groups were contested, and this would be a way to navigate the situation and to be as neutral as possible. This completely backfired. Upon our arrival to the district headquarters, Pramila and I met with one of the male leaders of the victims group. In the meeting, I had a feeling that my explanations, mainly through Pramila's translation, about what the research was about, were not quite having the response I had hoped. Our contact did not seem as enthusiastic to work with us as he had been in previous conversations over the phone. Besides this nagging feeling, everything seemed promising. Our contact had offered to travel with us to Rajapur, a remote area, to conduct interviews with women active in the group. He explained how this would be beneficial for him too, as he would not be able to travel there to meet the members otherwise this time of the year. In the meeting, I explained that we had contacted one of the human rights NGOs in the district and would conduct interviews also through them to have variation in the data. But I emphasized that our main focus would be to make the trip he had suggested, and we agreed to discuss details the following afternoon. As I mentioned in episode 2, that same evening, through a chance encounter, we had a meeting with the representative of the human rights NGO whom we had been in contact with. And he offered to contact women who were involved in a group associated with this NGO so that we could conduct interviews the next day. On that day, in between conducting the interviews, we tried to get in touch with our contact to finalize the details of the trip to Rajapur, but he did not answer his phone. It transpired, through a mutual acquaintance whom Pramila called, that he was not answering our calls and no longer wanted to work with us because we had gone through the NGOs instead. After much persuasion, our contact agreed to meet us again and to discuss what had happened. It turned out that he had contacted the same women whom we had been interviewing, but only after the NGO representative had already been in touch with them. Whilst I was aware of the contentious relations between the human rights NGO and the victims group in Nepal, I had assumed that there was a distinct separate group associated with the NGO. In reality, it turned out that the women whom we interviewed were both members of the victims group and in touch with several NGOs. So I realized my nagging feeling about the meeting not having gone well was to do with my plans to contact a human rights NGO. The second meeting turned out to be crucial in building trust, as our contact was able to confront us about the issue directly. And through Pramila's negotiation skills and the good sense of humor shared by all, we managed to establish the following. that I was not yet a very experienced researcher, that we wanted to work directly through the Victims Association, and that the contact was willing to travel with us. The reason I'm sharing the story here is that to me this incident demonstrated how there was an ongoing tense negotiation over who was to facilitate contact between internationals, in this case me, and the families whose loved ones had been disappeared or killed. Was it going to be representatives of the national level NGOs or leaders and members of the family associations and victims groups? Due to this incident, and based on the conversations I had with this group leader, I was expecting to hear stories about an adverse relationship between NGOs and victims groups when meeting and interviewing women activists in Padilla and other districts. Yet, the questions that were geared towards delving deeper into the relations produced stories that were complex and could not be reduced what I had imagined as a rather rigid difference between what the NGOs do and what the victims groups do. And next, we will delve deeper into these stories.
Here we meet Devika. Hannah met Devika in Kavre, which is a district east of Kathmandu and is just a couple of hours away by drive. It is a place where people commute daily to and from the city for work, so it's not that far from the city. Devika's husband had been disappeared by the army. She identified herself as a strong woman and a leader in a victims group. The group was associated with a human rights NGO active in the district. And Hannah had interviewed her in her home, which was located in the district headquarters. Throughout the meeting with Devika, she critiqued the conduct of NGOs focusing on practices around funding.
जति पनि विदेशीहरूले चाहिँ सहयोग दिनुहुन्छ त्यो चाहिँ अरु संस्था द्वन्द्व पीडित बाहेकको संस्थाको हातमा जान The amount of support given by the foreign organizations usually goes to organizations that are not working for the conflict victims. So it goes in the hands of NGOs, and for us to move forward, we are not even asked about it. That is our problem. If the foreign donors want to support us, then the fund should come directly to us. It should not go to any other person or organization in the middle. All the foreign donors and well-wishers that want to support us and help us should directly contact us and give us the funds. And if they do so, we will work accordingly and show full accountability and transparency regarding those funds. We will not do any kind of fishy activity regarding those funds because we are the people who have lost our families during the time of conflict. We have lost our husband, our children, and we are not the kind of people who would misutilize the fund for our own selfish needs and fun.
And as I mentioned earlier, here we can hear her frustration with the system. And it's very natural to feel this way. Although Devika herself is a victim, she's also a woman with an immense leadership role in her community, especially in the victims groups. But time and time again, she mentions how although being at the forefront of the movement, she rarely has access or control over the funds and resources from international donors. She talks about how funds should come directly to them and that the victims group would ensure transparency and accountability for them. And this seemed to resonate with most of the women activists in the interviews. However, this rarely happens. NGOs and INGOs are usually the facilitators between the activists and the donor agencies. And we need to look at the factors that prevent women like Devika from having direct access to resources, including how the INGOs and NGOs need to focus on helping to bridge the gap. I think this is something that has to be addressed because time and time again, we have seen that, okay, there's a vulnerable population that have significant issues. We need to build a program for them. We need to develop proposals for their benefit. But during all these conversations, rarely are questions like what are their actual needs and what do they want to be addressed asked. So yes, there is a huge gap in communication between the stakeholders and the target population. And in this whole process, the actual voices of women activists are not even included in the debate itself.
Thanks so much for that, Swastika. I couldn't agree more, but I think as an insider, you really can say it so powerfully. I wanted to also add that what struck me when I was in the interview situation and when reading Devika's interview afterwards was that throughout the interview, she distinguishes between we, the people who have lost our families, and NGOs based on how they conduct themselves. So the NGOs are positioned as the kinds of people who misuse funds and so on, in contrast to the people who have lost their families, who would show accountability and transparency. Similar distinctions emerged in other interviews. The women positioning the conflict victims or families of disappeared as honest and speaking the truth, in contrast to NGOs who were playing games and bringing programs in our names. What is important also, I think, is that here Devika employs the specific terms accountability and transparency. Thereby, she evaluates the conduct of NGOs through the very terms that the human rights NGO representatives themselves use to critique the conduct of government officials in the context of relief program and terms that are used by donors to evaluate the conduct of NGOs. In this way, she is employing the NGO's own criteria to reject their mediating role and to put forward the suggestion that foreign donors and well-wishers, as she says, work directly with the victims' organization she represents. So when we asked whether it had been possible for her to directly communicate with foreign donors or these well-wishers, she responded.
हामीलाई त्यस्तो कसरी गर्ने नै थाहा छैन। अब पहिलो कुरो त हामीलाई त्यो अंग्रेजी पनि खर्र बोल्न आउँदैन र सबै समस्या पनि लेखेर दिन सक्दैनौं। We do not even know how we should go about getting those kind of funds or to reach there. The first thing is that we are not fluent in writing in English, and we cannot write all of our problems and give it to them. The problem is because of the language. We cannot say or write it in Nepali for the foreigners. We are only surviving through the funds that we receive through others. Regarding the program designing and all those things, we do not know where we should go, who should we meet. We do not know how to deal with the ones who support us. We do not know the way or the procedure to do so. So for us to even learn how to do that, we need the help of others. We need to take someone that already knows these things with us. But what happened is that they turn out taking advantage of us. That is how it is.
To me, Devika's explanation about how she and other people active in the movement do not know how to deal with the ones who support them illustrates how the role of NGOs as necessary facilitators stems from their specialist skills. These would be skills such as command of English, as Svastika discussed, and knowledge about program design and about crucial understanding of processes, as Devika says about where we should go and who we should meet. What I also found striking was how throughout the interview situation, Devika positioned me as someone who had potential contacts to those who support us and who had knowledge about procedures. When our meeting and interaction is situated in this way, the distinctions Devika draws between NGOs misusing funds and the members of victims' organizations as honest can be conceived as a kind of a strategy through which she seeks to establish a base upon which to build connections with well-wishers such as me. Connections which would allow the victims group she represents to circumvent the mediating role of NGOs. And it is exactly these kinds of negotiations that I have tried to highlight in the research. To me, these are instances where it is possible to get a glimpse of how organizing a movement from the margins of power takes a lot of work, energy, and strength.
Yes, Hannah, I absolutely agree with what you are saying. But also there are many other women like Devika who are not in close proximity to the city, where outsiders or well-wishers such as you would be frequently visiting. So, it'd be interesting to know what their situation is like or whether they feel the same. What do you think?
Such a good point. I think it is important to note that in some ways Devika was in a relatively advantageous position. Devika lived in Kavre, a district in close proximity to Kathmandu and not far from the town that was the administrative center of the district. In this way, the comparison to many of the other women I met, especially the women who lived in more remote parts of Badia and Panke, geographically it was easier for her to access the headquarters of human rights NGOs and INGOs in Kathmandu. Further, while she belonged to a Hill Janachati group, she spoke Nepali fluently and had studied up to secondary level. And even then, she talks about how the NGOs are indispensable, how it is not possible to circumvent them completely, how they are necessary for successfully pursuing the cause. And the way in which NGOs continue to be indispensable came through powerfully also in Ayushma's comments, who we met in an earlier episode.
मलाई कति भेट्नेले पनि भन्छन् तपाई बरु आफै सक्षम हुनुहुन्छ किन एनजीओ तिर गइरहनुहुन्छ तपाईहरु पीडित यस्तो एकदमै बलियो हुनुहुन्छ Many people who have met me also told me that I am very much empowered by myself. Why do you have to go to NGO or be a part of it at all? Even though you are a victim, you are very strong. Why don't you raise issues yourself? Why do you go to the NGOs? These are the kind of questions people ask me or tell me. But who will provide the fund for the refreshments? That is the challenge here. Yes, people are still stuck for the refreshments and tea. These are the things that are there.
This is so relatable. Mainly because, when I look back at my experience of working in Nepal, it is these things that mattered. Of course, as an NGO or INGO activist, you do want to have programs planned for the target community. But at the same time, the logistical support is of crucial importance. If NGOs do not provide that kind of support, really the participation of people would be very, very low. And this is from my personal experience. And we have seen this, and I think it exists in all development work, that the target community gets some logistical support like refreshment, transport costs, etc., to encourage them to participate in programs. I think sometimes it is like an incentive to increase participation. Now, as Ayushma has said, of course, these women are strong women who are able to lead the movement. But then again, for them to have access to resources, they do need to partner with the local NGOs. And there is certain kind of bureaucracy where NGOs do not let the target population have direct contact with donor agencies. Hence, sometimes there is a complex relationship and connections between the women activists and the people working in the human rights NGOs. Almost like a love-hate relationship, if I may call it that.
When reading and rereading the interview transcripts, I noticed that when the women named district-level representatives or specific NGOs, these were almost uniformly positive comments. In these descriptions, the women referred to specific individuals using their first names, rather than the abstract term NGOs and INGOs that was used when these actors were critiqued for their improper conduct, as Devika did on funding. When the women named specific individuals, their role was to do with negotiating on the women's behalf, especially to navigate bureaucratic processes required to access the government's interim relief program. The district-level staff members whom I talked to linked their own efforts and work with the aim of trying to alleviate what they called the victimizing effects of the bureaucratic process that they explained lacked human representatives of a human rights NGO. Also emphasized the need to address the urgent economic needs of the family members.
उदाहरणको लागि मानौ एकजनालाई 75% अपाङ्गता छ तर माथिबाट 10. For example, if a person is disabled and from here it is considered that 75% of his body is disabled, but from top level it comes as only 20% or 10%. They don't even bother to see or ask. They just deduct it randomly, so we feel very frustrated sometimes. I mean, can you imagine that after the recommendation of the local peace committee, it takes months to receive the compensation money that was for the death of your husband? It's so hurting.
What I think is important to note is that in interviews and meetings I had with people working in the human rights NGOs, they often complained about the government's interim relief program, noting how it was aimed at distracting the families whose members had been killed or disappeared from demanding justice. As they saw it, it was part of an attempt by both of the parties in the conflict to escape responsibility for the human rights violations committed during the war. And yet, the people working in the NGOs spent considerable time and personal effort making sure that the families accessed this relief. So, I have started to think that these practices, such as filling in forms, asking after specific cases, etc., that had come attached to the interim relief program, in many ways reflect solidarities that had emerged between the women activists and the district-level representatives of human rights NGO. At this point, Many of the district level representatives had worked for several years with the same families and knew in detail about their difficult circumstances. The reason why I wanted to mention this is that I feel that these kinds of practical ways in which the NGOs were involved in the lives of the women I met played a crucial part in the women's ability to sustain the movement. Also, to me, these kinds of nuances show how the relation between the human rights NGOs and the women active in the victims' movement is much more complex than it might seem at first. What I was interested to find out as well was whether there were differences in the ways in which the women activists mobilized and the advocacy practices of the NGOs. Did they have distinct modes of mobilizing, and what might be some of the frictions and negotiations around this? These questions were prompted strongly by an encounter I had with Rashmila.
We have met Rashmila, one of the women activists from the western rural parts of Nepal, in episode 2 already. And we have also heard about how Rashmila's husband was made to disappear by the state and how through the experience of loss and grief, she became active. Here, she goes on to share her story as a female activist about the kinds of negotiations she has pursued with the more established NGOs.
तर हाम्रो जुन विधान बनेको छ विधानको शान्तिपूर्वक आन्दोलन गर भनेको छ हामी त्यो विधान But according to the rules it mentions that we have to take our movement in a peaceful manner. We have to take that point in consideration and work accordingly. And we have been doing the same. If we do not abide by that, then the district administration will blacklist our organization. There are lots of obstacles and challenges. Due to this reason, loads of discussions have been done and so have plannings. But because we do not want to bring our organization in jeopardy, we have not been able to do such extensive programs.
Yet, despite her expressed commitment to the rules of our movement, Rashmila was frustrated with the ineffectiveness of the current modes of mobilization and articulated a possibility of needing to change tactics.
कहिलेसम्म लुकाएर राख्छ त राज्यले एक न एक दिन त खुलाउनै पर्छ नि यदि उसले चाहेर खुलाएन भने हामी आफैले फोडेर भए पनि त्यो निकाल्नु पर्छ क्या How long can the government hide the facts? One day the government should disclose the facts. If the government does not disclose, we will break the door and disclose by ourselves.
What followed this statement was a description of many plans that we had in Bardia.
अनि जति पनि आउने संघ संस्थाहरूलाई हामीले योजना बनाइदिनुस् कि एउटा हलमा पुरै दलका नेताहरू बोलाउने कार्यक्रम We requested to the organization to make a plan to call all political parties inside a hall. Call all the political leaders. We don't want to make them promises. We will only lock the door from outside. We'll just stop them communicating with the families for 2 days. Then they can realize about our difficulties.
This explanation was interrupted by Pramila, who seemed alarmed by this suggested tactic. She went on to ask, how is that possible? It will supply wrong information.
हो गलत अर्थ लाग्छ हो त्यही भएर सहयोग गर्नुहुन्न त्यसरी हैन Yes, it gives a negative impression. Because of this, you do not provide support to us, isn't it?
I think that this initial response is important. To me, it shows how Rashmila, prompted by Pramila's comment, suggested that us, a foreign researcher and a research assistant who is a Kathmandu-based journalist with a relatively high socio-economic status, would have certain ideas about what would be the legitimate tactics for conducting the movement. Rashmila then continued.
तर हाम्रो आक्रोश चाहिँ त्यस्तो हुन्छ उहाँहरूलाई एक दिन पनि आफ्नो बच्चा स्कुलबाट 1 घण्टा ढिलो भयो भने कस्तो पीडा हुन्छ But our wrath is like this. In one day, if the children arrive 1 hour late from school, how much tension will they have? Yes or no? Today, where is my child? Why is he late? It has been 12 years for us that our loved ones are missing. They have been far away since 12 years. How do we feel if we don't get the real information about them? Our person is somewhere or not. They will come or not. These political leaders could not realize our tension. Yes, country has changed. The monarchy system was finished. Everything was changed. It should have been done before. Where are the missing persons? How is the situation of the children of disappeared people? How is the situation of the families? How is the situation of the parents?
When we hear about Rashmila's frustration with the political leaders, we can see why she is frustrated. Most of the women activists feel that the government has failed them because even after so many years, the status of the family members who have been made to disappear is not disclosed, even till date. And I think the NGOs do try very hard to create some kind of boundaries or framework within which they can work and try to build their capacities accordingly. But at the same time, this creates more complex procedures and different layers of formal representation, which sometimes the women activists feel does not bring the result that they hope for.
I agree. And what I wanted to stress perhaps even further is the importance of Rashmila's suggestion to use tactics that border on illegal, because it's interesting to grapple with what she sees as a justified, even if illegal, means of action. Rashmila's reflections need to be connected to the broader emphasis that the women I met put on so-called civil forms of organizing. The women emphasized how their own organization had certain rules and agreements over appropriate modes of mobilization, and good working relationships with at least certain specific NGOs and INGOs, and an internal formalized structure. I think that this emphasis is one of the reasons why the interviewee's relationship with the NGOs and INGOs is so complex and hard to unpack without losing important nuances. On the one hand, these actors are continuously described through practices that render them in a way uncivil, such as non-transparent use of funds and showing disrespect towards the victims. On the other hand, the women I met emphasized how their own organization and all the NGOs and INGOs working for the victims have the same goal, and how, to be successful, all of them need to unite and work together. So far, we have talked about how the women activists recognize the value in fostering these kind of good relations as indispensable for the continuation of their struggle due to the financial support and expertise the NGOs and INGOs provided. Retaining this relationship required committing to modes of mobilization accepted and practiced by these NGOs, rather than possibly illegal forms as Rashmila threatened. But I also think that the emphasis on civil forms of organizing cannot be reduced to a strategic negotiation aimed at securing necessary support. This interpretation misses the importance the women I met placed on being someone who occupied a position, on being a member, chair of a committee, or in leadership, and more precisely, on occupying these positions within a group that was at the same time our organization and an official organization. What emerged from my research then was a certain aspiration, I would say, towards civil forms of organizing, the tendency to posit our organization as one of having similarities as well as differences with the large formalized NGOs. I think that this aspiration was a manifestation of the women activists' struggle to be recognized and treated as citizens, a struggle that goes to the core of what the fight for justice is about.
This is Women at War and Its Aftermath, a podcast about the untold stories of women who fight and mobilise for what they believe in. The podcast is co-hosted by Swastika Kazaju and Hannah Kettler, and co-produced and co-edited with Lizzie Ellen Aisha Khan. The voices for the stories are provided by Ankita Manadur, Divya Tapamagar, Manita Shrestha, and Abhishek Shrestha. This podcast series was made possible by funding from the Economic and Social Science Research Council and King's College London. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate and review us on your preferred podcast provider. It really helps us reach more listeners with our inspiring stories of women at war.